Hey, we're here when we are back for part two. We'll kind of get into the Eisenhower administration. We'll start with civil rights, and we'll kind of bridge the 40s and the 50s. Remember the civil rights under Truman. He's kind of known for desegregating the military after the war. So it wasn't during the war, but after World War II, Truman desegregates the military. The Brooklyn Dodgers, they use Jackie Robinson and break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. It is sort of as the testing ground as to test America's willingness for all-out integration. And the experiment with baseball was a huge success. And then the NAACP is going to go after Plessy versus Ferguson, which of course 1896 court case that ruled separate but equal is constitutional, and the civil rights kind of gets underway again wholeheartedly in 1954 with a Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, where little Linda Brown was forced to walk miles to the black school where there's a white school right down yonder. And the NAACP, and with the lawyer of Thurgood Marshall, is able to persuade the Supreme Court in 1954 that separate but equal is indeed a violation of the 14th Amendment because it creates a sense of inferiority. And the Supreme Court had just, obviously is now mandating integration in all public facilities. And this is kind of where Eisenhower wanted the civil rights movement to come from. As far as the federal government, it should be kind of led by the courts, which of course we talked about in class, the southern senators and the southern congressmen. None too pleased with the rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States, and proclaimed their Southern Manifesto that the Supreme Court has abused its power. And this is really a states' rights issue, and the federal government cannot dictate at all how these southern states can run their states. And so they were very slow in integrating. The stat that I threw out in classes by the end of the 1950s, only less than 1% of all schools in the South were actually integrated. So it was slow, and Eisenhower was, I would say, was as usual his moderate self on the civil rights. Does have a very weak Civil Rights Act passed in 1957. It does not really curtail the segregation of the South. There's no teeth in that civil rights bill in 1957. You'll see the real economic bite in Civil Rights Act of 1964, where the federal government can withhold funds to states if they do not integrate. And but in 57, a very meek bill was passed, and which of course prompted Jackie Robinson to really help the civil rights cause in writing letters to Eisenhower to that he needs to do more. And Robinson really was influential because not only is he writing Eisenhower, he was also a guide, if you would, a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., who rises to prominence after the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott in a state that I believe is called Alabama, where the city of Montgomery refused to integrate the bus system. And Rosa Parks, the NAACP, was going to challenge this, and of course she gets arrested, thrown into the clink, and forcing Montgomery to overturn the integration or the segregation. And they wouldn't, so they organized the bus boycott. And MLK was sort of like the one of the main organizers of this, and this sort of becomes the mantra of the civil rights movement of the 50s. Is really a non-violent, passive resistance, and that's going to be the early steam of the engine that will be known as the civil rights movement in the 50s, and then obviously in the 60s it turns a little bit more violent. But that we shall pick that up on another chapter. Well, let's go now to Eisenhower's Cold War, his policies, kind of piggybacking on Truman. The Cold War policy of containment will be continued by Eisenhower, but his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, is going to add a little might to it. He's kind of throwing out the phrases besides containment. He's also throwing out the phrase of massive retaliation, brinkmanship, where he is pledging that the United States will be willing to bring the world to a brink of nuclear annihilation to stop communism. We will have a massive retaliation to any Soviet aggression anywhere. We will be willing to go out to a full-scale, all-out nuclear war to stop communism. And that is going to be the mantra of Eisenhower's Cold War policies. And with that, of course, is going to be the building up the military-industrial complex. It basically means that the United States is going to put half of its budget towards military and defense spending. The new cabinet, the new cabinet of Secretary of Defense is created. It's no longer Secretary of War; it's the Secretary of Defense. This military-industrial complex is going to be building up not lessen the Army, but more missiles and more bombs and more rockets and more weapons that will be used to curtail communism. And again, Eisenhower warns about this at the end of his administration. Is this the direction that the United States wants to go? So he was warning us of the military-industrial complex. But one of the main Cold War acts that really gets passed was the National Highway Act of 1956, which of course is passed because of the military measure. But of course it creates 42,000 miles of interstate highway, which has a massive economic impact for the United States with construction, road construction, jobs, housing development. Again, that's Chapter 32. Dependency on cars, gas, rubber, the whole, it helps all those industries, very much like the Gilded Age had impact. The railroad had impact on steel and oil. Well, the National Highway Act has a huge impact on the automobile. So that's, hopefully you see that comparison where how one business creates and stimulates others. Well, that's what the Highway Act did, of course. Back to the Cold War, we had talked about that we're seeing communism spreading to Asia. When China went communist in '49, there was a conflict in South Korea, and the next conflict in Asia is with a place called Vietnam. And in 1954 Geneva Conference, the conference splits Vietnam into two. Northern half was led by Communist Ho Chi Minh, who's a Vietnamese nationalist, and the southern half was an allied or U.S.-backed South Vietnam, and we put into power a pro-U.S. ally. And with the caveat of there will be free elections in 2 years to determine. Hi, Jody. To determine if there were free elections in Vietnam. And in 2 years, everybody will, of course, vote. And Ho Chi Minh was extremely popular. And that, of course, that election never happens. And that leads us to, I believe, Chapter 34, which is the beginning of the Vietnam War. But the seeds have been planted. Vietnam has been split in half: North communist, South Southern Vietnam, of course, is backed by the United States, and the fact that communism could spread from North Vietnam to South Vietnam mandates the United States to get involved. Because most kids always ask, why do we even get involved in Vietnam? Because communism was going to spread down, and we pledged to stop it. Plain and simple. Not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong. Plain and simple, that's our policy. We got to live with it. In 1956, there was a Hungarian revolt Remember, are those Eastern European nations, satellite nations, if you would, controlled by Stalin after the war, and those are the countries behind Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain. Those are the satellite countries of Eastern Europe controlled, even though they don't want to be. Who would want to be controlled by Stalin? Well, in 1956, Stalin's dead in 53, so Nikita Khrushchev is the new premier of the Soviet Union. And in 1956, Hungary staged a revolt against the Soviet regime, and the Soviet military crushed the Hungarian revolt. And the United States chose not to intervene because it was already controlled by the Soviet Union, and we were not willing to risk an all-out war when it is a piece of land. Hungary was already controlled by the Soviet Union. So kids were asking, why didn't we do it then? Well, that was already controlled by the Soviet Union. And we have one more part, and we'll be right back.